Hello, everybody. Welcome to Objective Religion. I'm Dr. Frank Newport.
And I'm Reverend Nate Brantingham.
And this is our podcast where we look at religion from an objective standpoint. And Nate, we are going to be looking at religion and election 2020 every week between now and the election, which is November the 3rd. Now, by way of background, I am currently a Gallup senior scientist and for 30 years was Gallup editor-in-chief. I have a great interest in religion and looking at religion from an objective standpoint. I published books on religion, a lot of articles, many articles on religion, speeches on religion from a sociological objective standpoint. And that's what I'm bringing to this podcast. And Nate, you?
And I am a Presbyterian pastor, and I work with campus ministry. So I bring a slightly different view and a very religious view focus on this election, and that's my lens. And I'm very excited to dive into that. It's looking like it's already heating up around the religious topic. But before we do that, are we going to do a quiz, Frank?
Let's do. And let's bring in our producer, Micah Lambert, with our quiz question of the day. Micah, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Okay. What percentage of Catholic voters voted for JFK and for John Kerry, the last two major party Catholic candidates?
All right. Actually, Nate, prior to Kerry and prior to John Kennedy, the only other Catholic candidate in history, U.S. history, for a major party, as Micah said, was Al Smith. And that was, as you well remember, way back in the election of 1928.
Remember,
so we have an unusual situation this year. Joe Biden, of course, is Catholic, and he's only the fourth, which is really fascinating to me, only the fourth Catholic to capture or going to capture the nomination as we speak. He hasn't yet gotten it officially. He's going to capture the nomination of a major political party as a Catholic.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm really curious about whether or not there's a tie-in. I'm trying to guess how I would answer that quiz, but we'll wait to the end.
Absolutely. Nate, one of the features that we want to emphasize in our podcast as we go week by week in this election season is what has been in the news. I've been fascinated by the amount of coverage that religion has received relating to this election so far. So we'll call this That Was the Week That Was in terms of religion and the election. And over the past week or so, we've had a lot of news already relating to the role that religion may or may not play in terms of this presidential election.
Right. Biden is launching the Believers for Biden campaign. So back in 2016, it seemed like Trump really gathered a lot of that evangelical support and religious support, and Clinton didn't do quite a great job tracking that down. Biden seems to be taking a different approach and going for it right from the start.
Absolutely. One headline I saw this week was Biden campaign faith director talks Christian beliefs outreach to evangelicals. And what that indicates, as you said, is that Biden has actually appointed an evangelical individual. His name is Josh Dixon. He's an evangelical Christian, and Biden's appointed him to head up his efforts to reach evangelical Christians, whom, as you indicated, Nate, certainly, and we'll be talking about a little later in this podcast, overwhelmingly voted for Trump back in 2016, and he's hoping will continue to vote for him this time.
Yeah, that base has been credited with giving Trump the election. So I think they're not, the opposing party now isn't willing to just sit on the sidelines on this one. I see another article, how Trump and Biden are making their pitches to religious voters.
That's right. Trump this week, I saw a news headline mentioning that he went on a Catholic television network talking to Catholics, trying to reach their vote. And again, Biden's a Catholic candidate, but Trump is reaching out for them. I also thought it was fascinating that Joe Biden's wife, Dr. Jill Biden, had an online Zoom event this past week. It was called Believers for Biden. And you mentioned that. That's Biden's new group, Believers for Biden. But she held an event, Believers for Biden National Call to Action, featuring Dr. Jill Biden. So she was out there Zooming, trying to reach individuals for whom faith might be important and get them to vote for her husband.
And really fascinating conversation that happened was Donald Trump saying in an interview that if Biden wins the election, religion will be gone.
That's right. I think he said in another headline this week something like, God will be gone as well if Biden is elected. Do you know what he's referring to, Nate?
In the statement, religion will be gone?
Yeah. What is his rationale, President Trump's rationale for saying that if Biden is elected, religion will be gone?
Well, it's around the COVID thing because in my understanding anyway, that because they're keeping churches closed and keeping people doing remote church, that Trump's making the claim that religion won't be able to survive that. And if Biden's elected and continues that sort of shutdowns and the protections in place, that churches will be forced to close their doors, and that will be the end of organized religion in America.
Yeah, so he's taking a pretty small fact of life, which is that there's some differences about whether churches should be allowed to open up, as there are, of course, differences of opinion about schools opening up and businesses opening up and so on and so forth. President Trump is seizing on that and saying because Democrats are less likely to want schools to open, therefore, if Biden is elected, religion will be gone, right? Pretty big leap of faith, so to speak, but that's what Trump was talking about in that headline. I was interested...
I was going to say, not a small change of life. I mean, it's been as someone in the religious community and working with churches, that's a major shift in how we do church. But to jump from there's going to be challenges or new ways that we do church to church is gone does seem a bit of a leap. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Now, one of the issues for Biden, and we're going to talk about this in the weeks to come, probably in next week's episode, we'll talk more about Joe Biden because that will be the week of the Democratic Convention, which is going to be held in Milwaukee. There was a headline this week, the Democrats Biden doesn't want. That came in the Wall Street Journal. And it was written by a couple of individuals who said, we're liberal and we're pro-life, and the party refuses even to ask for our votes. So there is some sensitivity here, some tension, because Joe Biden is a practicing Catholic and he is pro-abortion. He's not anti-abortion, as, of course, Catholic doctrine would dictate. And therefore, there are individuals who are going to see that as a pushback. And what we're seeing in this headline is that these are some Democrats who are pro-life, anti-abortion, and they're saying Biden's ignoring us. And so that opens up kind of our window to another possible tension in this election relating to religion.
And do we have numbers on that, Frank, about how big of a group that is? The ones who identify both as a Democrat and pro-life? It seems like that'd be pretty hard to find those numbers, but do we know?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers with me right now, but nothing's monolithic. I guess that's, as a data analyst, I would say that, Nate. Clearly, Democrats are less likely to be against abortion than Republicans, or phrased differently, Republicans are more likely to be against abortions than Democrats, but nothing's 100%. So there are a number of Democrats nationally who, in answer to survey questions, would say that they are against abortion or would consider themselves pro-life. So there are some out there, and apparently there are some people who are going to argue that that's a good reason not to vote for Joe Biden because he is not against abortion.
Yeah. And I see another article about the same thing, Frank. Democrats for Life warn abortion policies could alienate religious voters. So I am curious to see if that coalition picks up and how big of a push that's going to be.
Absolutely. We know that the Trump campaign is going to use abortion as one of their wedge issues. They're going to emphasize the election of judges who are going to be against abortion in their rulings and so on and so forth. So that's a clear tool that the Trump campaign is going to use to try to solidify support and increase turnout among his supporters. But you have an interesting point there. Will that be a weakness for Biden? Because as we've talked about, he's a Catholic and he is pro-abortion.
Right. And I'm seeing also that the Lincoln Project, which has been getting a lot of headlines for their way that they're a Republican group that's been really pushing hard on Trump and trying to pull voters away from Trump, is teaming up with religious groups. Vote Common Good and the Lincoln Project are working together to try to urge GOP faith voters to support Biden instead.
So what do you think about that, Nate? You think they'll be successful?
Well, I don't know that they're going to be able to get him to vote for Biden, but I think both the Lincoln Project and Vote Common Good would be just as happy if those GOP faith voters decided to sit this one out. And I think that's probably a more realistic goal, whether that'll work or not. But I think there is some disillusionment that they're trying to pull on here in order to get those voters to change from the support they gave back in 2016.
Yes, I think one of the significant factors on this, Nate, is that at least they are trying. I think one of the things that Hillary Clinton did not do well in 2016 was to try to reach faith voters, or at least say, I'm interested in you as a voting bloc. And of course, Trump did. he very explicitly said, I am interested in you and I will support you. And if you're worried about being marginalized as religious voters, I will stop that from happening. And Hillary didn't talk about it much at all. So the fact that Biden, and now as you mentioned, this Lincoln Republican group and others are at least reaching out to faith voters and saying there's some reasons why Biden is concerned about you and will support you, I think is significant. He's certainly doing better on that front, I would say so far, than was the case in 2016 for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So another segment that we want to do, Frank, is we want to take the questions that our listeners have who are following this election. And they're, of course, going to have questions about how religion is going to impact that. And we're going to address that. And so we've primed the pump here, and we've got some questions from listeners, which are going to be read to us by our producer, Micah Lambert.
Why do evangelicals support Trump despite his personal characteristics?
Well, you know, Micah, that's the number one question that I get anywhere I go or anybody I talk to, and I think we're going to hear that from our listeners as well. That's the number one question, given Trump's lack of personal religiosity and given the fact that his personal life is not one that we would usually think of as a deeply religious individual's lifestyle. Why do evangelicals support Donald Trump? That's such an important question and such a complex question. How's this, Nate, that I think we're going to devote at least one episode to that in the next few weeks, one or two episodes actually, because it's very complex. I've been studying this and studying this and studying this and writing about it, and there's no easy answer to that question. I would say, however, one thing that we really need to consider is history. To me, the question isn't so much why do evangelicals support Trump now, but why over the last number of decades, going back to Ronald Reagan and even before, have evangelicals overwhelmingly supported Republican presidential candidates? That's the real question, because Trump is just the latest in a series of Republicans that evangelicals have supported. So we're going to talk about that, get into that. And I guess the real question is, why haven't more evangelicals pulled back from support of Donald Trump, a Republican candidate? That is usually the case because of his personality and his personal lifestyle issues. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about.
But another question, too, that kind of ties into that is, where was the evangelical support during the primaries? Because that was when they had a choice between different candidates. If that evangelical support was for Trump during the primaries, then that would show that there might be something particular about this candidate that they liked even before he became.
And if we go back to 2016, I think we will find there wasn't a lot of evangelical support for Trump in the primaries. They were supporting other candidates. And then when Trump looked like he was going to get the nomination, and then, of course, he did get the nomination in 2016, evangelicals swung over and supported him overwhelmingly. And, of course, this year, Trump has the nomination, so there's been no real contesting of that. But evangelicals have been very strong in their support for Trump ever since about 8 out of 10 voted for him back in 2016.
Okay, here's a second question. How important are mainline Protestants going to be in this election? People don't talk about these people very much, but could they be a critical factor?
Well, Nate, that's you, right? You're a Presbyterian.
I am.
A Presbyterian minister. What do you think? This group of, let's say, white mainline Protestants, important in this election?
The distinction between white mainline and black mainline Protestants, I think that might be an important distinction, to make. They tend not always to vote in the same direction, right? So, well, you're going to know the stats better than I do about how big of numbers those are. But mainline Protestants, you tell me, how do they break down across the voting pools?
Well, I think we'll get into that in some depth in just a few moments. They're not an insignificant group, and a lot of these definitions of these groups kind of depends on who's doing the defining. But mainline Protestants, probably white mainline Protestants, which would be, we should clarify, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Congregationalists, and so forth. These individuals probably are 13 to 15% of the voting pie. These would be white mainline Protestants. The interesting factor, though, Nate, is that these individuals tend to skew Republican. From what we can tell, looking at the data right now, we've got a skew towards Trump among white mainline Protestants, not nearly as big as the skew is among white evangelical Protestants, but white mainline Protestants do skew towards support for Trump. In our data, for example, we can see they have a higher approval rating for Trump. And Pew Research recently asked people, who are you going to vote for, Biden or Trump? And when they separated out what they call non-evangelical white Protestants, which would be, for the most part, mainline, they found about 6 in 10 said they were going to be supporting Trump. So I think they're open to persuasion. They can move, but we have to keep in mind that these individuals right now skew more to Trump. So that's going to be Biden's challenge, is trying to bring some of those back towards his candidacy.
How compatible will Black voters who vote overwhelmingly Democratic be with Biden and his Catholicism and pro-abortion positions?
Well, that's a very interesting question, don't you think, Nate? You've got Blacks who are overwhelmingly Protestant, Baptists by far the number one denomination, and here you've got a Catholic president. It used to be there was a huge gulf, because I was raised Southern Baptist, and I certainly recognize this in my history, a huge gulf between Protestants and Catholics. And now you've got a Catholic president who's a presidential candidate who's going after their support. So it's going to be interesting. The question is, Nate, not so much will Black voters vote for Biden. 80% voted for Hillary Clinton, and every expectation and looking at our data now show that at least that percent will vote for Biden if they vote. But the real question will be turnout. Is Biden going to be able to generate enthusiastic turnout among Black voters?
What's interesting here, Frank, is that Biden's making a pretty strong indication that the vice president candidate choice is going to be a Black woman. And that could be a move to garner some support and some enthusiasm from the Black community. And then if there's a faith component in that selection choice, that too could pull in some of the Black faith votes. So that a lot of that might depend on where that vice president choice goes.
I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the, if you want to be just practical about it, look at politics as a very practical discipline. One of the values to the campaign of a Black woman as his vice president nominee would be that candidate's ability to increase turnout in the Black community. Keep in mind, Nate, that when you look at the graph of Black turnout over time, we saw a big jump up for the two Obama elections, not surprisingly, 2008, 2012. In fact, I believe in 2012, the turnout percentage among Black voters was higher than among white voters. But one of the problems for Hillary Clinton is Black turnout percent dropped back down when she ran. She was not able to generate that same enthusiasm that Obama was. So one of the challenges for Biden will be try to get that Black turnout percentage back up closer to where it was for Obama, above where it was for Clinton. And as you say, his VP nominee, his vice presidential nominee, could be a factor in that. Micah, one more question from our listeners.
Yes, here's the last one. So can we assume that religion will be important in the 2020 election?
That's what we've been talking about, right, Nate?
Yeah, and I think it really is. My answer to this one's going to be yes. It's going to be critically important to the outcome of the 2020 election.
I think you're right. I think that and I've been monitoring these elections in my position as a public opinion specialist going back to the 92 election. And before that, I was, of course, interested, but not as professionally involved. And I can say, I think religion is probably going to be more important in this election from what I'm seeing than any of these previous elections that we've looked at.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, even 2016, the religion was important for the election of Donald Trump. But I think the importance of that was understood after the election. Once people looked at the data of who voted how and who showed up and where the turnout came from, then there started to be a conversation like, wow, religion was really important in this election. But that wasn't really happening in the election season leading up to the election. That was only after. And so now I think people are going into 2020 with this awareness that religion might decide this entire election. I mean, a lot of other forces as well, but all other things being equal, religion could be the tipping point.
Nate, you're absolutely right. And when I've looked back at the history of religion in American presidential elections, you see sometimes when it really did raise its head, so to speak. You remember well the election of 1800?
Yeah, I sure do. I was right there.
It was Thomas Jefferson was challenging the incumbent, John Adams. And of course, Jefferson was challenged back then because he was not actively religious. He was called a deist, I believe. And the Adams people against Jefferson said, we're going to have a man in the White House who doesn't believe in God and so forth. So we had religion involved there. The election of 1896, history shows,
another one.
William Jennings Bryan. You remember that well.
I do.
Yeah. He was running as the Democratic candidate, and he was a fundamentalist. He was very religious, and his opponent, William McKinley, who ended up winning, by the way, Bryant lost, really his campaign, at any rate, brought up William Jennings Bryan's religion critically. He said, you're going to have this fundamentalist who's going to bring religion into the White House and so forth and so on. And that could have been a factor, along with a lot of other things, in Bryan not winning. You remember William Jennings Bryan, as an old man, got involved in the Scopes monkey trial back in, in the 1920s. When, again, he was involved in the legal criticism of a teacher a high school teacher who was attempting to teach evolution in Tennessee. So Bryan, all of his life, was a fundamentalist, and that certainly reared its head when he was the official nominee of the Democratic Party back in 1896. And then we look at history. I think two of the big things we've seen in recent half century or so. One is what we've been talking about, the connection between evangelical voting and Republican presidential candidates, a huge phenomenon that started after World War II and really accelerated with Ronald Reagan's campaign. And then the other is we've had, as we talked about, Micah read that question, several, now 3, Roman Catholic candidates. We had John Kennedy in 1960. Religion was a huge part of that election. Kennedy had to respond to criticisms that there would be installed a telephone line between the White House and the Vatican, and the Pope would be telling Kennedy how to run the country. And he responded artfully and won. And then in 2004, we had another Catholic candidate, John Kerry, who ran against George W. Bush, who was running for re-election. And Catholicism came up there, but it was no longer the issue that Kerry would be too Catholic, but I think for Kerry, the issue came up, was he not Catholic enough when it came to abortion? And now, of course, we have Biden again, as we talked about, running as the 4th Catholic major party nominee in our history.
And another point where religion is going to enter into this as a big unknown so far is who's that vice president candidate going to be, and how is that going to change the religious landscape of the opposition party?
Absolutely. We know Biden's a Catholic, practicing Catholic. We don't know who his vice president will be. And just a note, Nate, on the Republican side, what religion is Trump? I'll ask you that question.
Yeah. Well, officially, he's Presbyterian, so from my tribe, but he's been spending a lot of time with the Prosperity Gospel tribe. So it's kind of, that's a more of a non-denominational lean there.
That's how he was raised. I think he was maybe baptized as a Presbyterian, but his father and his family in New York City went over to Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York City. Supposedly, that's what historians tell us when he was raised. And that is, the power of positive thinking, very prosperity gospel orientation for Norman Vincent Peale back then. I think he was kind of no evidence of him being highly religious in the decades since then. But now when he started running in 2016, I'm not sure he would say he is an evangelical, or even evangelicals would say he is personally an evangelical, but certainly, maybe some would, but he certainly has begun to appeal to that group. So that's where Trump stands right now. His vice president, Pence, very interesting guy.
Very religious.
Indeed, he was raised a Catholic. He had a strong Catholic family from what I read, but he changed over to become more evangelical. In college, Pence did. And now he, of course, had done, at one point he said, by the way, I'm an evangelical Catholic. Did you know that?
No, I hadn't heard that.
Vice President Pence. But now he's very much an evangelical, and that certainly he provides that function for the Trump campaign. And as you say, we have a 4th person for the tickets that we don't know. That's going to be the vice president for Biden. It's going to be a woman, perhaps a black female. One thing that's interesting to me, Nate, is that 2 of the people that have been discussed, 2 of the women that have been discussed as possible vice presidential nominees, were raised with a non-Christian religion on their mother's side and Baptist religion on the father's side. Isn't that interesting?
I think it's fascinating. Yeah, I think that really does illustrate the more interdenominational and interfaith things that are happening in American families. So I think it's actually a good representation of what a lot of families look like in America.
Yeah, those 2 would be Tammy Duckworth, your senator there in Illinois. Her mother was Thai and was a practicing Buddhist. Her father was American, was Baptist. And Tammy Duckworth, now it's unclear what her religion is. When I look it up, I can't really find evidence of which way she has gone. And the other is Kamala Harris. Her mother was from India and was a Hindu in religion, and her father was Baptist as well. Kamala Harris now does identify as a Baptist, not a Hindu, so she's been more definitive than Tammy Duckworth. But as you say, the interesting point is both of these people, Duckworth and Harris, being considered as possible vice presidential candidates, were raised in a by-faith household.
And Frank, currently, American voters, if we break them down by faith, just to give us a background for this conversation as we're going to have it in the weeks to come, what's that breakdown look like? How big of the camps are there?
Well, we could look at it as a pie chart and then look at each one of these slices of the pie and look at how they tend to move in a political sense. The biggest slice of the pie is probably Catholics. anywhere from 20 to 23%. Catholics were 23% of the vote in 2016, according to exit polls. Catholics, and we're going to talk about this next week in more detail, have to be split, though. That's too huge of a group to look at as a monolithic group. You've got Hispanic Catholics, you've got active Catholics, for whom abortion is important. You have kind of lapsed Catholics who still identify as Catholics but no longer are active. They're less Republican. You've got a lot of slices of that pie for Catholics, but that's the largest group. The second largest group would be the nuns. And Nate, you can tell us from our previous discussions, nuns tend to do what politically?
They tend to be much more democratic politically.
That's absolutely right. Nuns, which that means they don't have an active religious faith, at least when pollsters call them up, they say they don't have a religious identity, tend to skew significantly towards Democratic voting, so they are significantly for Biden. The next groups would be Protestants, and we can split Protestants up. We've got, of course, evangelical Protestants that we've talked about, skew much for Trump. The percent of the population of the voting group that's going to be evangelical, white evangelicals, depends on who you look at, but anywhere from 15 to 20%, maybe a little more. You've got mainline Protestants, we talked about them, skew more Trump, but more up. And then you've up for grabs. And then you've got, of course, black Protestants. Most black voters are Protestants, and they're overwhelmingly for Biden. So you've got those groups. And then what's left is you've got some other Christian groups like Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so forth, and they tend to skew very Republican, very reliable Republican voters. And then you have a group of people who are non-Christian, identified with non-Christian religion. That's 5 or 6% of the population, and they tend to skew Democratic.
And
Muslims,
the Jewish
Hindus, Buddhists, and so forth.
And I cut you off there a little bit, but the Jewish vote, what's the percent of that, and where does that tend to go?
Yeah, that's about 2% of the population is Jewish. About 70% of Jews that voted, according to exit polls back in 2016, voted for Hillary Clinton. So it's not monolithically Democratic, but clearly they skew more Democratic in their orientation. The Jewish vote typically is not highly important in presidential elections because they tend to be congregate in states that are reliable blue states like New York and New Jersey, and so don't make much difference. They're not in swing states in any huge proportion. They could make a difference in some instances, but the Jewish vote typically has not been one that's been up for grabs or not pursued heavily by presidential candidates.
So Frank, just in general, how important is someone's religion in deciding whether or not they're going to vote and where their vote might land? If we look at it as a whole, that whole pie.
Now, by religion, I think you mean religiosity. That is how
Yes.
religious they are personally. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Very important. It's actually a straightforward linear relationship, as we would say statistically. The more religious you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. There's a particularly huge difference between people who are very religious in general in America, say attend church weekly or say religion is extremely important in their daily life, and people say they never attend church and religion is not all important. The percentage of those who are Republican versus Democrat, the percentage who support Trump or don't is just huge. So religion in general, Nate, in answer to your question, religiosity is a very important predictor in today's American society of one's overall political leanings.
So as we head towards the end of our podcast, Frank, we've talked a lot about Biden's Catholicism and what impact that might have on the Catholic. And the whole time we kept doing that, I kept thinking back to that quiz. And now I'm dying to know the answer. Is his Catholicism really going to have a strong impact on how this goes? And where do Catholics tend to vote? So Micah, can you reread that quiz for us, please?
Yes. What percentage of Catholic voters voted for JFK and for John Kerry, the last two major party Catholic candidates?
All right. The answer, John Kennedy, of course, ran against Richard Nixon in 1960. Our best estimates, we didn't have as reliable polling and so forth back in 1960, but the best estimate is 80% of Catholics voted for Kennedy, their fellow Catholic. Part of that is because Catholics tended to vote Democratic in general back then. Fast forward to 2004, John Kerry, a Catholic, running against George W. Bush, who was seeking re-election. The number dropped significantly. Catholics basically broke even voting between Bush and Kerry in 2004. Depending on what source we use, exit polls or the national election studies, the numbers vary a little, but roughly speaking, Catholics tended to split their vote between Kerry and George W. Bush. Bottom line there is, Micah and Nate, that we didn't see that John Kerry's Catholicism had any highly unusual positive impact on the Catholic vote in 2004.
So Catholic voters not likely to change their stance based on the Catholicism of the running person. So a Republican Catholic isn't going to jump over to Biden just because he's Catholic. He's going to have to court those votes.
That's right. Biden has a challenge trying to reach his fellow Catholics. Again, it's almost a quarter of all voters, and it really depends on which Catholics you look at. Biden's got less of a chance to reach active Catholics because of the abortion issue. Got more of a chance to try to reach lapsed Catholics, and I think he has a chance to try to reach Hispanic Catholics as well.
Well, Frank, that's about all the time we have for the podcast this week. It's looking like it's just going to be a fascinating time to be talking about religion and politics and the election this season. I know there's going to be a lot of more news articles and a lot more talking going into the weeks to come, but what do we think we might be talking about next week?
Now, remember, every Tuesday, an episode every Tuesday, once a week up until Election Day, November 3rd. Next week, we are going to focus on the Democrats. Why? Because it's the Democratic Convention. It's going to be held in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee. Joe Biden, the nominee, will not be attending in person, interestingly. We'll see if his announced vice presidential candidate will show up in person. I read that the Clintons, Bill and Hillary, are going to be there in person and so forth. But because it is the Democratic Convention, next week we will be talking about Biden, his religion, his Catholicism, his vice presidential candidate's religion, and how all of this might play into the election.
On top of the news, of course. Looking forward to it, Frank.
This has been Objective Religion. I'm Dr. Frank Newport.
And I'm Reverend Nate Brantingham.
And I'm Micah Lambert. And we love to hear from our listeners, so if you have any questions or comments about this topic specifically or about religion and politics in general, please reach out and leave us a voice message at 254-237-3298 or send us an email at objectivereligionpodcast@gmail.com. Both of these pieces of information will be in the show notes every week.
And thank you for listening. See you next Tuesday.